listener production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Terror attacks and the people accused of committing them will almost always elicit a strong response from the community, ranging from anger to outright hatred. So what's it like to get up and defend one of those people in court?
You've got to put aside your feelings about a particular individual, and often you'll get people say to you, how can you act for a particular person? Well, everybody is entitled to legal representation. It's a fundamental right we all have.
That chat with a top barrister who's defended a convicted terrorist is coming up in the second half of the show. First, though, it's time for headlines with Sasha Barbagat. It's Wednesday, the 18th of Feb.
Hey Chris, the men accused of attempting to bomb an Invasion Day rally in Perth can now be named. Police allege 32-year-old Liam Alexander Hall lobbed a device designed to explode on impact at a crowd in the city CBD on January 26. He's become the first person in Western Australia's history to be charged with a terrorism offence. Authorities alleging it was a nationalist and racially motivated attack targeting First Nations people.
We must let justice take its course. But we allege that the attacker was radicalised by online hateful and racist ideology.
That was WA Premier Roger Cook speaking there.
Up until now, Hall's identity had been kept off the public record due to a temporary suppression order that had been granted over concerns for his safety and reported mental health issues. But that was lifted yesterday following submissions from a Commonwealth prosecutor and lawyers for multiple media outlets. The magistrate saying it was in the interest of open justice and necessary given the seriousness of the charges. Hall is yet to enter pleas to any of the charges, which also include making or possessing explosives. If found guilty of the terrorism offence specifically, he could face life behind bars. He has been remanded in custody and the case will return to court next month.
To Canberra, where Angus Taylor has unveiled his new look frontbench 3 days after rolling Susan Lee for the Liberal Party leadership. So, who is in? Perhaps the biggest surprise is promoting moderate MP Tim Wilson to the Plum Treasury portfolio, while key Lee backers, including Anne Ruston and Andrew Bragg, have held on to their health and ageing and housing roles, respectively. There had been talk that moderates and supporters of his predecessor would be relegated to the backbench under Taylor.
He has, however, done as expected, elevate some key Conservatives, including Hastie Nampijinpa Price to the role of Shadow Minister for Skills and Training, Andrew Hastie to the Industry and Sovereign Capability portfolio, and Sarah Henderson into the Communications role. Deputy Jane Hume will take on the Employment and Industrial Relations portfolio. Another key move by Taylor was to reinstate the Nationals who'd been dumped under Lee for crossing the floor against Labor's hate speech laws.
As to who is out, well, like we said, there was an expectation that a bunch of Lee backers would be relegated to the backbench, and that has happened for Paul Scar, Alex Hawke, Melissa Price and Andrew Wallace. Now, we actually are sitting down with the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party later today, and we will bring you that chat with Jane Hume tomorrow morning.
A landmark study involving 76,000 people has found racism in Australian universities is systemic, with some institutions failing to keep students and staff safe.
Universities are great institutions, but they're not perfect. And Australia is not a racist country, but racism exists.
That was Education Minister Jason Clare there. The study by the Australian Human Rights Commission found 69% of uni students and staff have experienced some form of indirect racism while at university, so things like hearing or seeing racist behaviour directed at their community, while 15% say they've experienced it directly.
The rates were the highest for Jewish and Palestinian respondents at more than 90%. Followed by First Nations, Chinese, Middle Eastern and Northeast Asian respondents. And the study also found that international students experienced it more frequently than their domestic counterparts.
Yeah, and we did hear from the Race Discrimination Commissioner, and he said that they, trawled through 1.4 million words in completing this study. And some of the examples highlighted included mocking Palestinian peers with shouts of terrorism, some First Nations students being compared to petrol sniffers in lecture halls, calls to send Jewish students to the camps, and making fun of the eyes of Asian students. And one, detailed that another student on campus had said that they smelt like noodles. So some pretty awful examples coming through there. The report did, though, make 47 recommendations, including a national framework for anti-racism in tertiary education. And the federal government has taken that on notice.
Get ready to pay more again for your private health insurance. Yes, the federal government has once again approved a hike to our premiums, and it'll go up by 4.41% from April 1st. And that's the biggest jump we've seen in almost a decade, Chris.
Yeah, and the increase is being blamed on the growing cost of hospital care and an ageing population needing more treatment. 15 million Aussies hold private cover, and premiums have more than doubled in the past 16 years.
Yeah, so what does that look like to your hip pocket? I had a little look around. So if you pay what is typical for a hospital-only policy, which a lot of over 30s have to have in order to not have to pay a full Medicare levy, you're going to look at about $115 extra a year. For a combined hospital and extras policy, which averages around $3,500 every year, you're looking at paying an extra $157 extra annually. So it is not a small amount. And that's the other thing is they've doubled in just over 15 years. So, yeah, doesn't look like that trend's stopping anytime soon.
Famed civil rights activist Jesse Jackson has died with tributes flowing from all corners of American politics. The 84-year-old was a Baptist minister and close associate of Martin Luther King Jr. during America's fight for civil rights in the 1960s.
I may be poor, but I am somebody.
He also ran for president twice as a Democrat in the 1980s and was special envoy to Africa for then President Bill Clinton in the 90s. US President Donald Trump has paid tribute to the civil rights leader, calling him a good man with lots of personality and street smarts, while Joe Biden has praised Jackson as determined and tenacious.
Oh, shout out to our audio producer who is loving this song this morning. And look, let's get into the story, I guess. Aussie pubs and clubs have now become more resilient than our cafes. New data has analysed the closure rates of venues across the country, finding places we drink at are better at absorbing rising costs and are less likely to be hit by volatility seen in the seesawing prices of fresh food.
Cafes and restaurants, on the flip side, have been hit by increases to the minimum wage, as well as rising rents and food prices. 1 in 10, Chris, have had to close in the past year, which is really sad because I think we can all appreciate our local cafe or the one that's around the corner from work. Like, they are often our lifeline, but it's seen because of what they offer, their margins are razor thin. So if there's any sort of hit to that, i.e. their rent goes up, that's it. They have to close. They can't shoulder that burden. And on the flip side, for pubs and like RSLs and clubs, they have diversified their revenue streams. So they're more into food these days. Pretty much every pub you can go to, my dodgy local, shout out Concord West Hotel. It's no gastro pub, but, you know, people want to sit down and have, you know, some fish and chips and their beer. But also gaming is worth noting as well with venues, is that they can pull the revenue from pokies and things like that. But I thought we should maybe ask our listeners to let's start a campaign, Chris.
A campaign.
A one-day campaign.
We're getting around our
local cafes and restaurants. So I want to shout out my local, which is Appetite Cafe in Five Dock. Such a great spot. They really diversified during COVID as well. They, you know, started doing like little cocktails in jars and like anything to just keep people interested and keep people buying. They do amazing food, amazing coffee. But I thought we could put a prompt in the broadcast channel, Chris, and ask people, wherever you are in Australia, we're in Sydney, but wherever you are, shout out your favourite local and, you know, let's just give them some love.
Absolutely. And if you're in Sydney Southwest and you are craving for a burger, get around East Avenue in Oatley. It is delicious.
Okay.
Shout out to you, George. We absolutely, you've never been, but I love what you do. I love what you do. Look, that is it for our headlines for today. Coming up next is my chat with a top barrister who's defended a terrorist in the past, and we unpack what that's actually like. Stick around, that deep dive is coming up for you next. This week, we had our first look at the accused Bondi terrorist since he and his father allegedly killed 15 people celebrating Hanukkah on December 14 last year. Naveed Akram is facing almost 60 charges, including 15 counts of murder and 1 count of committing a terrorist act. Facing court from Goulburn Supermax Jail, the 24-year-old only said one word when asked if he understood something. His lawyer, though, was pretty forthcoming outside court when he was asked how he could defend the man accused of Australia's deadliest terror attack.
He's just a client, and he's a client that needs to be represented, and we don't let our personal view get in the way of our professional obligations.
So, how exactly do lawyers put aside the alleged atrocities of a potential client to defend them in court, and how do they ensure their safety in instances where community anger is at an all-time high? Joining me now is a senior barrister and someone who has wrestled with those exact issues, having defended a convicted member of a terrorist organisation. He also worked on the legal team for Julian Assange. Greg Barnes, welcome to the briefing. I want to start this chat by asking you, what is it like to defend someone who's accused of plotting a high-profile terror attack?
Well, I was one of the counsel involved in the Melbourne, what's called the Melbourne terrorism trial, 2008. And that was a very lengthy trial. There was a lot of evidence from the prosecution, particularly of phone calls and listening devices in various properties. So it went for some months. I mean, it's stressful because it's a high-profile case, as you say. The law in this area can be quite complex and the evidence can be voluminous. I mean, it just depends on the case. But sometimes in these sorts of cases, the evidence that is produced by the prosecution is fairly lengthy.
In terms of personal feelings, I guess I know it's, as a lawyer, you sort of have to park those judgments, but did you struggle with parking any of those judgments or personal feelings you may have had towards your client or their alleged act?
Absolutely. I mean, as a lawyer, your ethical obligation is to the court and your ethical obligation is to your client. And this is not a court of morality. So you've got to put aside your feelings about a particular individual. And often you'll get people say to you, how can you act for a particular person? Well, because everybody is entitled to legal representation. It's a fundamental right we all have. And that's why the legal profession exists. And that's why we have the rules we do to make sure that everybody gets representation.
Is there any crime or crime type that you would draw the line at? And I guess where does that line come in for you? I know there have been lawyers that we've heard from in the past who may have a personal connection to a particular type of crime and that's where they draw the line. For you, does that line exist?
I fortunately haven't had that experience, but of course, some lawyers may have had a family experience, for example, in the assault area and just find it too triggering. They're just too close to it emotionally and rightly don't take on those cases. I haven't found that. I certainly wouldn't act in a case where I knew the person or I knew about the incident and knew people who'd been affected by it. But, generally speaking, particularly at the bar where you have what's called the cab rank principle, which means that, you pick up the next fare. I don't want to trivialise it, but that's where the cab rank principle comes from, that you take on the next case. I mean, it's changed a little bit because there are now specialists. I mean, there are some lawyers who won't take on a case who are barristers because they don't practice in that area. They don't practice in criminal law or they don't practice in commercial law. I mean, certain cases I wouldn't take because I don't have the expertise, but that would be the reason for not taking the case. It wouldn't be anything else.
Now, we know that Naveed Akram, he struggled to find legal representation. In your opinion, is that quite usual in cases like these, in high-profile cases like this?
Look, I think it's pretty hard to say, and I don't want to comment on any particular case, make that very, very clear. It does happen. Sometimes happens in regional areas, and certainly in Tasmania, where I do a lot of work, I have heard of it happening simply because so many people might have a connection or a potential conflict of interest. But look, it does happen.
I'm curious to know, as much as, when these cases unfold, we are looking at the people that are accused of these certain crimes. There's also a particular amount of attention that, is then put onto their lawyers, and yourself included. You'd be quite familiar with this, having to front media, having to constantly be questioned about why you're representing or speak on behalf of your client. I guess for you, how did you handle almost the personal and professional pressure that working on a case like you did caused you at that time?
In Australia, we don't have the American system where lawyers go out at the end of the day and talk about the evidence and talk about what they're going to do tomorrow. Generally speaking, Chris, lawyers are not permitted to speak to the media. There are exceptions to that. Solicitors, for example, can, and you often see them out the front of court. I think lawyers can say, my client will vigorously contest the charges. We look forward to these charges for our day in court, something like that. After a case, a solicitor might come out and say, I've got instructions that my client wishes to appeal, but generally you can't say any more. And that, as I say, I think is in a great contrast to the United States, where we've all seen, in various high-profile trials, the lawyers come out and talk. I mean, we saw that with the Trump cases. We saw it with the famous O.J. Simpson case 30-odd years ago. The issue with the media is more around prejudice. So you do get applications made now for a stay of a trial, and some of those have been successful, where there's been, for example, saturation media, which is pretty adverse to an accused. What a court will do sometimes, the judge will say, I'm going to put this trial off for a number of months because I'm concerned about the level of coverage, the adverse nature of the coverage, and getting a jury that hasn't been impacted by it. In very rare cases, and they are very rare, you get what's called a permanent stay. In other words, the media coverage, social media and conventional media coverage has been so great that it would be impossible for a person to get a fair trial. Often the way around that is to have a judge-alone trial, which you can have in some states like New South Wales. You might remember that case of Christopher Dawson, who was convicted of the murder of his wife. There'd been a very high-profile podcast done and a lot of discussion. That was a judge-alone trial. There was one in Western Australia that was similar some years ago. That's more the issue, making sure that the media is not going to sort of flood the zone, as it were, with such adverse press that it makes it difficult for people to get a fair trial.
I want to talk the role and responsibility of a lawyer in cases like these. What are some of the key legal principles at play? We know innocent until proven guilty. That's a staple of our criminal law system. What are some other principles that operate here?
In all cases, in all criminal trials or civil matters, if you're acting for the accused or a defendant in a civil trial, it's up to the prosecution or the plaintiff in a civil trial to prove their case. In one, beyond reasonable doubt, and in the other, of course, in civil cases, on the balance of probabilities. It's important to remember in criminal trials that the defence, generally speaking, does not have to adduce any evidence. So your client has the right to silence. That's a right that we all have. And so sometimes lawyers get criticised, why didn't your client go into the witness box and give evidence? Well, they don't have to, and that can't be used against them. Then, of course, you've got the jury itself, and, your role is to convince the jury, and lawyers have some role of advising their client in relation to jury selection. So you get some of your listeners, and you might have been in a position, Chris, where you're in a jury pool. They bring the pool into court and say, well, we've got to get 12 of you. And, of course, depending on the state, the defence has a number of challenges, and as lawyers, there are different practices in different states, but generally speaking, one of the lawyers can assist the accused in that jury selection. I'm
curious to know, there are certain protections that apply to the accused in certain criminal trials, but there's also some protections that are afforded to lawyers. We know in New Zealand, the lawyer representing the Christchurch terrorist, in his appeal, their name has been suppressed and hasn't been made public. Can you explain why a judge would make a suppression order to that extent?
A judge might make a suppression order if he or she thinks there could be some issues around the security of counsel. I mean, the Christchurch massacre was obviously an extremely emotional experience for New Zealanders, and obviously if the judge made that ruling, it would have been on the basis that ensuring that the lawyers were not at risk. It's fairly rare, but it does happen. If there are any sorts of threats made to lawyers, whether it's the defence or prosecution, they have to be taken seriously, and a court will take them seriously.
Greg, before we let you go, I guess if someone's made it this far into the chat and still might be of the opinion that someone who's committed a terrorist offence or is accused of committing a terrorist offence is just undeserving of legal representation, what would your message be to them? We all, and I mean all of us, have the right to legal representation. And often when people say that, I say to them, what if a member of your family or you committed or alleged to have committed a very, very serious crime that got a lot of press in the community? You would want representation. Oh, yes, I'd want representation. It's a fundamental right, and our system works because people have representation.
And of course, that doesn't matter whether or not the person goes to trial and the prosecution has to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. It also applies, of course, if a person pleads guilty. If a person pleads guilty and it's a particularly serious and awful crime and it has had a lot of adverse press in the community, again, that person is entitled to legal representation, and it's important they have it because a fair trial is a fundamental element of our society. And the moment you start saying, oh, well, we won't have it for these cases, you're undermining your democracy. I mean, it's that serious. That's what happens in countries that don't have robust legal systems.
Greg, we thank you for making the time and hopping on the line to unpack it all for us.
Thanks, Chris.
That was Senior Barrister Greg Barnes speaking with me there, and that is it for this episode of The Briefing. If you enjoyed this chat or you learned something new, why not flick it over to a mate? And while you're there, leave us a rate and a review. I'm Chris Spyrou. I'll catch you next time.